Chapter 14, the peripheral nervous system. So, the peripheral nervous system, as we know, is broken down into many components. There's the sensory component, where you have somatic sensory input coming from the sensations we're consciously aware of, and the visceral sensory input coming from things like the stretch in our digestive tract, organs, the blood pressure, the composition of blood, things like that that we're not as commonly aware of. That is all sensory information going through the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And then from the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system comes the motor division, the sending out commands to cause effects. And this gets broken down again into the somatic nervous system for the skeletal, controlling skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which gets broken into sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. And these divisions both innervate all the same structures, the smooth muscle tissue of hollow organs, cardiac muscle tissue in the heart, and glands. So the sensory receptors can be defined on where they're located and where the sensation is. So exteroceptors are detecting stimulus outside of the body, external stimulation, like light coming into the eyes, something touching your skin, things like that. Interoceptors are detecting internal stimulus, things that are occurring inside the body, the stretch of organs, blood pressure, composition of blood, that sort of thing. And then the proprioceptors are kind of a mix between the two. Proprioceptors are specific for skeletal muscles and joints, and they are detecting things like stretch in the muscles and joints and how they're moving and where they are located relative to each other. So that's proprioceptors. Receptors can also be broken down by the stimulus detected. So photoreceptors detect light. Mechanoreceptors detect a shape physically change, a change in their physical shape. So for instance, when a touch receptor is stimulated, it's because something is pushing on it, changing the shape of the receptor. That is what is detected. Thermoreceptors detect temperature and change in temperature. Chemoreceptors bind to specific chemicals. So chemoreceptors actually bind to some sort of molecule to get a response. And then finally, nociceptors. Nociceptors are the receptors for pain, and they can detect all kinds of things. So that could be overstimulation of other kinds of receptors. It could be actual physical damage to the body, and so on. You can also define sensory receptors by their structure. Many of them are free nerve endings, are the dendrites of sensory neurons. So the receptor and the neuron are the same thing. So we have a lot of free nerve endings in the skin, for instance. We have the epithelial tactile complexes. These are able to detect light touch on the skin. We have hair follicle receptors where the dendrites are wrapping around hair follicles so that when the hair is moved by something, we can detect that. And there are other various free nerve endings throughout the skin detecting things like temperature, pain, and so on. You can also have encapsulated nerve endings. Here, the dendrites are wrapped around by connective tissue. So, for instance, we have the tactile corpuscles. Tactile corpuscles found also in the skin near the epidermis. They can detect touch and light pressure. We have the lamellar corpuscles deeper in the dermis for pressure. Pressure being how hard something is pushing on you, so distinguishing between a light touch and something pushing really, really hard. And then also the bulbous corpuscles, also in the dermis, and they also detect pressure. All right, the structure of receptors include the proprioceptors. So we have the muscle spindles that are found in muscles and tendon organs that are found in tendons. So muscle spindles are actually isolated individual skeletal muscle cells that are wrapped around by connective tissue, and it is the stretch in these specific muscle cells that are the stimulus for the information getting sent to the brain. And then tendon organs are basically nerve endings found in tendons and ligaments, and when the tendons and ligaments get stretched, causes a shape change in the dendrites of the sensory neurons, generating the signal. All right, moving on to the olfactory cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These are nerves coming off of the brain. First up is olfactory nerve. Olfactory nerve, the neurons are in the olfactory epithelium. The olfactory epithelium lies on the roof of the nasal cavity. Chemicals that we breathe in through our nose will bind to the receptors, and then that information, that stimulus, will get sent via sensory neurons through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone up to the cranial cavity. There, they will synapse in the olfactory bulb. So here is the olfactory bulbs on the inferior surface of the frontal lobes. And then frontal bulbs will then transmit that information signet down the olfactory tracts, and it'll eventually arrive in the temporal lobes, primary olfactory area. So again, this sense bypasses the thalamus, goes from the sensory neurons, the olfactory nerves carrying the information from the nasal cavity to the brain, and then in the brain from the olfactory bulb through the olfactory tract to the primary olfactory area in the temporal lobe. Then we have our optic nerve. Optic nerves, two of them, one for each eye. The receptors are found in the retina of the eye, and they detect light. And then they transmit that information to sensory neurons that then form the optic nerves that leave the eyeballs, travel into the brain. There, the two optic nerves come together to form a structure called the optic chiasm. You can see the optic chiasm is right next to the hypothalamus. And there, the nerves reorganize so that your medial fields of vision switch sides. So part of what you see on the right side is going to the left, part of what you see on the left side is going to the right. From here, these sensory neurons then transmit their information to the thalamus. There we have a synapsing occur, and then from there we have sensory neurons carrying, interneurons carrying information to the primary visual area in the occipital lobe. So we have it going through the optic nerves, through the optic chiasm, where the nerves reorganize into the thalamus, and from there synapsing to send the information to the primary visual area in the occipital lobe. Then we have three cranial nerves: oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, and abducens nerve. These three nerves control different muscles that move the eyeball. So these are motor nerves. The only thing they do is control some of the muscles that move the eyeball. Then we have the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve branches into three big branches, hence the name tri. It is both a mixed nerve, both sensory and motor commands are being sent. So the sensory information, it can detect touch sensations. It can detect what's going on in the bones of the skull. So for instance, if you're getting a root canal, it's often a branch of the trigeminal nerve that the dentist has to numb. And that is the sensory information being sent to the brain, and then the trigeminal nerves also control the muscles for chewing, such as the temporalis and masseter, and it also has some other effects for controlling minor muscles in the mouth, oral cavity. Facial nerve. Facial nerve, surprise, surprise, is going toward the face. It is another mixed nerve. It carries the sensory information for taste or gustation from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, and that gets sent to the brain. And then it also innervates some other structures, such as the superficial muscles that give us our facial expressions. So cranius, auricularis oculi, so zygomaticus major, and so on. And then also innervates some of these salivary glands. Vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. It is a sensory nerve. It only carries sensory information. It carries the information for hearing and equilibrium and carries that to the brain. So both hearing and equilibrium, and those structures that detect those sensations are housed in the temporal bones. If this nerve was damaged, you might suffer vertigo, where it feels like your body or the environment is constantly rotating and moving. You can experience ataxia, difficulty in coordinating your muscle movements, and of course, deafness. Glossopharyngeal nerve, that is cranial nerve 11. Glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve 9, sorry, this is cranial nerve 9. It innervates the posterior third of the tongue, so it carries the taste sensation for the back third of the tongue and carries that information to the brain. And it also has motor control. It can control some of the muscles important for swallowing, pharyngeal, throat, swallowing, and also some of the salivary glands for producing saliva. Cranial nerve 10 is vagus nerve. Cranial nerve 10 is vagus nerve. It is a mixed nerve. It is carrying both sensory information from structures in the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and it's also sending commands out to control the organs in the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. Also controls some of the muscles for swallowing and vocalizing and coughing. Vagus nerve is special because it is the only cranial nerve that is innervating structures outside of the head. So it is the only cranial nerve innervating structures in the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. And it goes to pretty much all of those organs. Accessory nerve. Accessory nerve is cranial nerve 11. It is a motor, exclusively a motor neuron. It controls the muscles that help us to move our head, to turn our head, to raise our shoulders, specifically trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. And then cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal. Hypoglossal nerve innervates muscles in the tongue and oral cavity, so it helps to control the movement of the tongue and swallowing. All right, then we have the spinal nerves. As we mentioned before, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord. Almost immediately, as soon as they leave the vertebral cavity, they split into a dorsal ramus going to the back side of the neck and trunk, and a ventral ramus that is going to go to the lateral sides of the neck and trunk, the ventral or front sides of the neck and trunk, and also the limbs. So the ventral ramus is the bigger of the two, and it controls much more of the body from the neck down. When the cranial nerves, when the spinal nerves leave and split into the ventral and dorsal rami, those rami then mix together, forming interconnections with each other, leading to structures that look kind of like meshes or webs, and they are called plexuses. So plexuses are interweaved connections between different ventral rami of the spinal nerves. And it's from these plexuses that we get some of our important named nerves. So there's the cervical plexus in the neck. Coming off of that is the phrenic nerve that innervates the diaphragm. The phrenic nerve, important for breathing and innervating the diaphragm. We have the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus toward the shoulder area forms such nerves as the radial nerve that innervates the posterior arm muscles of the arms, the ulnar nerve that innervates the anterior muscles of the lower arm, and the musculocutaneous nerve that innervates the anterior muscles of the upper arm. The intercostal spinal nerves do not form plexuses, so there is no plexus for them. They just go straight out to the areas of the thoracic cage that they innervate. The lumbar plexus gives us the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. The femoral nerve innervates the anterior thigh, the front of the thigh, and the obturator nerve innervates the medial thigh. And then we have the sacral plexus, and coming off of that is the sciatic nerve. And the sciatic nerve innervates the rest of the leg, all the rest of the muscles of the leg, the hamstrings in the back, the gastrocnemius, anterior tibialis, all those. Dermatomes. Dermatomes are different areas of the skin that are innervated by specific spinal nerves. These are helpful because the doctor can try stroking or touching these different parts of the skin, and if the person does not feel anything, it's numb, then that means that the doctor can get an idea of which spinal nerve or part of the spinal cord might be damaged. Shingles is basically chickenpox, but it gets stuck in nerves, and so it can lead to these reddened strips that generate when a person is older in age. There's a vaccine for it to help prevent it from bursting out